Hello, and welcome to the Early American Brass Band Podcast. I'm Chris Triano, joined always by Stephen Canistris.
Hi. Oh, I cut you off.
Ah, you cut me off that time. Now
Yeah.
nobody is going to know who was with me in episode 24. Oh well, they'll have to figure it out on their own, I guess. But
Yeah,
yes,
they'll figure it out.
This is episode 24, and in this episode we are interviewing Robb Stewart. Robb Stewart is known to many in the field of early American brass bands as a brass technician, brass restorer, brass repairman, brass historian, and collector. We are very excited to finally get to have Robb Stewart on the show.
Yeah, definitely. It was great to, like I said last week with Jeff Stockham, it's great to get another legend in the field whose name has come up countless times in previous episodes. Yeah, and it was great to pick his brain about brass instrument repair, restoration, and reproduction. So I really enjoyed talking to him, and I think you guys will enjoy the episode as well. And as always, if you like what you're hearing, you can support the show by sharing, liking, subscribing, commenting, rating, all that good stuff, wherever you're getting the podcast. As we said previously, we've got a Patreon page and a Teespring store now, if you want to check those out. We're very grateful for any support you're willing to give through, any avenue. So we hope that you'll check that stuff out as well.
Throughout the episode, we'll be referencing instruments and some of Robb Stewart's previous projects. If you want to follow along at home, you can go on Robb Stewart's website, www.robbstewart.com. That's Rob with 2 B's. So feel free to follow along there for any pictures. We'll also link that in the show notes and in the YouTube description. Without further ado, here is the interview with Robb Stewart.
Thanks so much, Rob, for taking the time to talk to us today. We're really excited to pick your brain about all things instrument repair, restoration, reproduction, all that good stuff.
Of course. Thanks so much for your interest in what I do.
Yeah. So we usually start with a little bit of background. So would you mind giving us kind of what your musical background is, your musical upbringing, and then, we can get into things from there.
Sure. Well, I started playing cornet in 5th grade, I believe. I think that's when most people do in the school band. Mm-hmm. And then I didn't pick the cornet, just there was one in the house because an older brother had played it for a year and quit, and so there it was. I think I wanted to play drums at the time, which is hard to believe with my personality. I wouldn't make a good drummer. But yeah, we had. I still have my old Selmer Signet cornet that my folks bought for $30.
Nice.
So yeah, I played cornet in the school bands through high school. Had a trumpet by the time I was like a junior in high school, and was a pretty good high school trumpet player and had ambitions to go on with it. But I think playing in some of the honor bands and I played in a community orchestra. It was high school and college kids. I suddenly realized that, there's a whole big world out there and I'm not all that good. So I thought, either I devote myself to practicing 8 hours a day or I find something else to do.
Right.
That's pretty much it. The music in our household, my mother played the piano and my sister plays the piano and not much else. A younger brother started playing saxophone after me, and he got a really good jazz player.
Awesome. So you didn't continue with music after, or pursuing music as a career after high school? No.
My senior year, I pretty much knew that wasn't going to be the path. So I headed towards business, and that's when I kind of fell into the repair thing. I hadn't really thought of the repair business before that. It seemed pretty mysterious to me, My dad had brought that cornet. The tuning slide was stuck, so he brought it to a local repair shop, and he was pretty pissed because it cost $12 to get the tuning slide working. It was only a $30 cornet.
Yeah, man.
So that was my only experience with repair. And then when I was a senior in high school, I was taking a night class at Fullerton College and motorcycle repair of all things. I thought, I might get into mechanics. Right next door to that was repair shop in a classroom, and the guy was taking students for night school, and I poked my head in there once in a while, and eventually he talked me into taking the class. So that's how it got started.
Nice. That's awesome. So this whole time you were kind of still playing the instrument on the side, or did you essentially put down playing altogether?
Yeah, I was playing in the high school band and all that stuff. I think I was still in the orchestra.
Oh, yeah.
And the first year out of high school, I went to Fullerton Junior College, and I played in the band and one or two other groups there, brass quintet, entertainment value. But eventually, it was taking up too much of my time. I had to quit that.
Yeah. And then
I'm going to make a living.
Yeah. So then did the interest in repair kind of take off faster and before your interest in historical instruments, or did they run kind of parallel, or how did that work?
I already had the interest in historical instruments before that. I grew up in northern Illinois, and even before we moved to California when I was 15, at the public library, I'd always be looking for books, on old cars, airplanes, boats, and musical instruments of all things. So I had already seen some of the books that I would later realize were some of the greats in the early studying historical musical instruments.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Now I'm kind of curious, what was your maybe career path, for lack of a better term, but so how did you get, from, you say your senior year in high school, taking the night classes, to kind of where you are now in the world of instrument repair?
Yeah, well, I was thinking of heading into engineering. I was accepted at Fullerton, Cal State Fullerton, the engineering department, when I was a senior. And, I just was never that great of a student. I think today, if I were a kid today, I'd be diagnosed with ADD, a hard time focusing. So I knew that it was going to be a tough haul if I went through the university. And, I was looking at other mechanical things at the time. And like I say, the musical instrument repair thing kind of fell in my lap, and I took to it right away. Within the first couple of months I was taking that night class, I think I announced to my mother, I'm going to be a brass instrument repairman. So I was pretty sure of it.
Yeah. And then did you work in shops, along the way, or did you kind of start out doing your own thing and have your own shop pretty much right off the bat?
Well, fairly early on, but I did. The teacher of that night class had a friend with a music store in Woodland Hills, California. And that guy contacted him and said, anybody that can do some brass repair here? So he got me my first job too, and that was less than 2 years after starting the class. Okay. So I moved to that area. It's the San Fernando Valley, and I went to work at the music store, which was kind of funny too, because my first day I literally show up to work and head back to the repair shop and ask the music store owner, well, who's the who's going to show me what to do here? Who's the brass repairman? And his response was, that's what I hired you for. So it was kind of sink or swim. I mean, I had experience in that class, but man, I knew very little.
Yeah. And then that's probably where you cut your teeth. I mean, when you're thrown into the fire, you really have no choice but to, figure things out quickly along the way, I guess, when stuff comes through. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that was a real good fit too, because that guy was his name was Norm Barthold, Barthold Music in Woodland Hills. It's long gone now, but he always, he was a collector and had some interest in historical instruments. Never very studious about it, but he had a pretty big collection of antique instruments. So from the very beginning, I was working on some pretty rare antique instruments.
Yeah, neat.
So was it with that hands-on opportunities with the antique instruments that you started kind of getting the bug a little bit and the itch to start amassing your own collection also? Was it around that time, or?
Yeah, probably. I couldn't really afford anything then. I remember things coming along that I could have purchased, but just couldn't afford it. In fact, it's funny that how good the memory is of my late teens, because there was one unsigned cornopian that was in rough shape that I could have purchased for $600. And there was also a Graves circular B-flat cornet that I could have purchased for $650.
Oh,
and
wow.
to me, they were almost the same. They were both so exotic. I had no idea that cornopian today is worth $200, and the Graves circular cornet is worth about $5,000.
Yeah, seriously. Wow, that's incredible.
But I had no idea who Graves was at the time. It was brand new to me.
Yeah, of course. Do you remember what this might be a difficult question, but do you remember what maybe your first like notable historical acquisition was that kind of got the ball rolling?
I still have it. Like I say, I still have my Selmer Signet cornet.
Yeah.
And side note there, when I was in that repair class, that cornet was also my first relacquer job.
Oh, cool.
So if I ever feel too full of myself, I can go and take that out and look at it and say, I've come a long way.
Yeah.
But I remember I still have my first two real antique instruments. The very first one is a 1884 Kahn E-flat cornet. It was really cheap. I think I paid less than $100 for it, but it was in really rough shape. So it was an early restoration too, and thoroughly restored it. And then the second one is even more notable. It's an E.G. Wright E-flat soprano, sax horn cornet, bell front. And another case of, I had no idea what it was. I realized it was similar to that Graves in terms of the rotary valves and all, but knew nothing else about who E.G. Wright was or anything. And I think I traded a Besson trumpet for it at the time. So, about $300 worth.
Yeah.
So that one I still have too. So those, and that took, that E.G. Wright plus the Graves and a few other instruments that I had seen before that really sparked my interest in the American industry. And, someone had given me a book, the Bob Eliason's, key bugles in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
Where he covered E.G. Wright pretty thoroughly. And I'd be looking at this instrument I had and the E.G. Wright key bugles, and I'd be thinking, there's a connection here. It's the same maker. It looks like it might even be the same bell, I thought, boy, this is pretty exotic. And from there is where I really started figuring, what else can I read about this? And I even wrote a letter. I think I still have a copy of the letter. Wrote a letter to Bob Eliason at Henry Ford Museum, and by that time he had left there, but luckily they forwarded it to him, so I still got a response from him,
cool.
from New Hampshire.
Very nice. That's awesome.
And he's really one of the greats in this area of interest. The research that he did starting in about 1968, I think. And, into the 70s, the articles and little booklets that he wrote for Henry Ford Museum and the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
The amazing thing is he was the first to really delve into this, and his articles still hold up today as the first go-to reference for the subject. There's very little that we've figured out since then, so Bob Eliason really needs to be mentioned in these, when we're talking about the brass instrument industry in the United States in the mid-19th century.
Of course.
Yeah.
Kind of going back a little bit when you were talking about historical instruments kind of coming into your shop, and having some of your earlier experiences, or not your shop, sorry, the other shop, but working on the instruments there. What are some of the most common issues that you would run into with very old instruments in particular that was kind of like the common things that need to be fixed or restored on them?
Always the biggest obstacles are the previous repairs.
Oh yeah, wow.
They're almost universally done badly and usually done damage to the instrument, making it harder to restore. I'd rather restore an instrument that is just bashed and smashed and but has never been repaired before than one that's been restored last week. And then I always refuse those ones these days, you know.
Yeah. Sure.
If you paid to restore it, why, you know, I can't bring it back to anything.
And then if you kind of have an instrument that maybe needs a little bit more extensive work, like it comes in missing parts and stuff, what's kind of your process of trying to restore an instrument that's basically coming to you in pieces?
Well, it's hard to verbally put in, you know, what's the process. Mostly just, you know, evaluate it to begin with and figure out what's original, what isn't, what's missing.
Do you fabricate parts mostly based off of like pictures and diagrams kind of thing, or
well, at this point, it's
copy other parts, or
mostly from experience. And
Right.
Often I have an instrument in my own collection that you know, I can refer to, like a keyed bugle or a lot of these rotary valve instruments.
That makes
that
sense.
aren't too obscure.
Yeah. It's probably really helpful when you have you know, a finished product. You know what it's supposed to look like. So when something comes in and looks nothing like what it's supposed to look like, I mean, now
exactly.
you know. Yeah.
I try to show that on my website too. Like it brings to mind I have a page just on reproducing the little tuning devices for the E-flat sopranos, you know, because it's I've seen so many that are so badly done, and some that are well done, but they look nothing like the original. You know, so they often function well, but they don't look anything like what they should. So I showed how you know how to make these things. It's one of the hardest things to make from scratch. Just, you know, carving out all the little parts, and they all have to fit perfectly. And
yeah. Is there ever a time, or I guess what's your philosophy with reproducing parts, or, you know, improving an instrument, where you prioritize functionality over period correctness? Is there any any situation where you would knowingly not reproduce something faithfully in terms of trying to make it function better?
Not on anything I consider historically important at all. You know, I have to just turn down some jobs where the guy wants like a extra key added to a keyed bugle or a ophiclide or something, you know.
Yeah.
You know, even if it's not that important of an ophiclide, I've had several requests in the last 5 to 10 years, you know, where I'm kind of on the fence about it. I'm thinking, well, that's not that important of an instrument, but I'm thinking, you know, I don't even need the work. You know, why would I want to cut up an original instrument?
Yeah.
Right. Happy.
Did you ever do a job like that you, after the fact, was kind of like, maybe I shouldn't have done that?
Regretted doing? I'm sure. Nothing. A good example doesn't really come to mind at the moment.
Well, that's a good thing, I guess, right?
Mostly that's far in my past, you know.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's always an interesting line to me to walk, like especially when you're doing restorations. And I think we asked Garmin Bowers a similar question to the one we just asked you about, like when you're restoring something, it's like that's very damaged. It's like, how far do you go, you know, until it's no longer the historical instrument that it came to you as, you know, like how much fabrication, you know, like what's the balance between fabricating new parts for something to make it function, and then as a result of the level of fabrication that you've done, it's like no longer very historically accurate, you know?
That's like
well, I would always make the part so it is accurate, even if
right.
It's not, you know. I mean, a real good example is recently where, you know, I wasn't sure what I was going to. An instrument I restored for myself. It's a Graves post horn from the 1840s, and you know, they're really rare. There's only, I think, 6 or 8 in existence, and it was really, really rough and just cracks in a lot of the tubing. So it took a lot of patches, you know, which, you know, I can see a museum person criticizing me even for that and saying, well, it's an artifact. It doesn't necessarily have to play. You can study this instrument in cracked, corroded, cruddy condition, and it's still worthy of preserving for that purpose. But I did decide to go ahead and restore it, and so I had to put a lot of patches on it. I had to make, it was missing one of the valve loops, and one of the main tubes was broken in several pieces and cracks as well. It would have been pretty much impossible to put patches to put it all back together. It had to have at least one sleeve plus 5 or 6 patches. It would have been so ugly. So I decided, well, okay, I'll make a new piece. So I made a new tube to replace it. But in those cases, I always hang on to the original parts. I think Jeff Stockham mentioned the same thing. That, we need to keep that in mind, that even if the goal is to restore this thing, we still want to retain the original parts, original fabric, for possible future study.
That brings to mind another question. Like when you're working on, an older instrument and doing patches and whatnot, are you using like modern material? Because I'm not even sure how different the metal is, between an old instrument and like more of the modern, stock that you might be using to reproduce parts.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because there's even been some studying done on what brass alloys were used. There's an article that was done by some, and I talked to one of the guys too, trying to figure out the exact content of the metal on some early 19th century French horns. And their conclusion, I was really glad the way they ended the article, because as I'm reading it, they're talking about, well, there's this content of zinc and this content of copper and this amount of lead, and and in my mind I'm thinking they're testing the alloy of 150 to 200-year-old brass that has deteriorated, and some of the material would have migrated out of it. Mostly the zinc is the least stable of most of the metals that are in it. So it's not going to have as much zinc as it originally had. So this is going on in my mind as I'm reading this thing. And then at the end, in the conclusion, they say, well, we can't be sure what alloy it was originally because it changes over time. The humidity and the heat and, the conditions that it had survived in will change mostly the surface, but even the interior, the fracturing in the metal, the zinc will migrate out. So anyway, so we don't even know for sure what alloys were, but with the beauty of brass is it's such a standard alloy now. It's hardly different than what was used 200 years ago.
Gotcha.
People have argued that with me, but the differences are much smaller, especially when you compare it to like nickel silver that we see a lot in American instruments. Those alloys are all over the place. Even in one instrument. One example, I even took a picture of it. I think it was a Fisk cornet. The crooks are made in halves and they're brazed together. And one half of a crook was visibly a different alloy than the other half of the same crook. So he ran out of his supply of nickel silver, and then his next sheet of nickel silver was a slightly different alloy.
Yeah,
wow.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So it's harder to patch nickel silver and have the alloy visually matched than it is with brass. Brass is usually quite easy. It's almost exactly like what we call cartridge brass today. It's approximately 70% copper, 30% zinc. That's not exact, but around that.
So I know a lot of times with period horns, we'll say how much softer the metal is or how much more malleable the metal is. Is that because they were using thinner brass, like just like less of it, or is it that change of the actual chemistry that makes it softer over time?
Mostly the former. Mostly it's thinner brass to begin with. Especially the mid 19th century, for some reason they like these things as light as possible, thin as possible, making them very light in your hands and easily damaged and such. So normally the deterioration of the metal will cause it to crack when it's bent, if it's badly deteriorated.
Gotcha. And that using the thinner metal or using the thinner brass back then probably made it more susceptible to body chemistry also, right? And as a form of deterioration.
Good question.
In terms of like skin and saliva kind of breaking it down.
Yeah, I think it's not that big of a factor really. I mean, it's going to deteriorate some, but if you use a modern trumpet for 20 years, 8 hours a day, it's going to deteriorate quite a bit. And it's interesting cultural question too, because these brass instruments were relatively much more expensive back then than they are today. Even a $3,000 trumpet today is cheaper than, a $50 or $60 cornet would have been in the 1860s. In terms of what people made, their income. So,
paying more for less metal
is that the brass bands were so popular that there are so many brass instruments from that time, considering how expensive they were.
Yeah.
How much they would have cost a person to buy, or a band to buy, or a town, whoever was paying for it. It was a big expenditure.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my point there, kind of rambling, but I think they treasured them more. They took better care of them for the most part, and they would have kept it clean and tried not to damage it and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm always surprised to see in pictures of bands, especially during like the Civil War and stuff, and you see them out in the field all holding their instruments and stuff, and I'm surprised that like the bells aren't like folded in half, and that there's like these like major like football-sized dents in these things, considering the elements and just the nature of what they were doing out there. I find it amazing that they seem relatively smooth back then.
Yeah. No, I think they did treasure them more than we do today. They took better care of them.
Speaking of taking care of personal instruments, we were kind of alluding to your collection and kind of your hobby of instrument collecting earlier, and you mentioned the first two period instruments that you kind of considered as being kind of the start to your historic collection. Are there any other instruments that you'd like to highlight, or maybe some gems in your collection that you'd like to talk about?
Well, that Graves post horn is one. I have a lot of things now that I never thought I would have owned, ever been able to acquire. That one partly because it was so incredibly rough condition that I could afford to buy it. And a few others, like I've always fancied the circular cornet, the American style circular cornets, much more than the over the shoulder cornets. So I've bought and sold a number of over the shoulder cornets over the years. And there's only one that I ever kept, and it's a Graves B flat from the 1850s, which is extremely rare, the only one known to exist. And the circular cornets, I never thought I would be able to own one, so I actually built one for myself, and took several years to copy a Graves circular cornet meticulously. I made the entire valve section, literally made every part of the horn. Whereas the replicas I normally make for people, I use modern valves and crooks and as many modern mass-produced parts as I can get away with. Otherwise, Anyway, so I got to figure that building this Graves circular cornet for myself, I would have had to charge a customer, I don't know, $12,000 to $15,000 for the amount of work. So, and then eventually I did buy a Fisk circular cornet.
Nice.
and I eventually sold that the Graves copy to Steve Ward. He has that now, which is kind of funny. To pay for the the Fisk circular cornet. And now I own 3 circular cornets: a Fisk, a Graves, and a Richardson. So,
I'm not familiar with the Richardson name.
no, it's much more obscure. I do have a page on my website where I did a lot of research because it's a very fascinating story. Richardson was an important part of the early Boston scene, brass instrument. He was in partnership with Henry Sibley, which is another guy we can talk about too, but and made brass instruments obviously on a much smaller scale than E.G. Wright and Graves and Allen and Fisk and those guys. But he was obviously an accomplished maker and quite mysterious because he, when researching him, mostly I find out about his professional career as a player and much less about his manufacturing. So he must have always just had a small shop or working in somebody else's shop. He was also in partnership with Leonard in Boston for a short time. So and some of these guys had a tendency to move around a lot, I guess opportunities.
Yeah, for sure. And Sibley was another Boston maker, you said? Yeah,
Sibley is a real interesting character. There's not, he's another guy that Bob Eliason wrote about as manufacturing the very earliest E-flat soprano keyed bugles by, basing it on the B-flat. And the Ned Kendall that Jeff Stockham mentioned that he played, that was made by Henry Sibley. And anyway, Henry Sibley's career started like in the 1820s or early 30s, and he was a machinist probably in the textile mills, and went on to work in the locomotive field, musical instrument field. He made artificial legs and umbrellas. He was involved in a lot of different stuff. Yeah. But anyway, his name keeps popping up, and it seems likely to me that he was connected with almost all the Boston makers before the 1860s. We don't have a direct connection between he and Graves or Wright, but it also appears that Wright started in a textile mill and learning machining, how to run machines and such. And so it seems likely to me that they certainly would have known each other, and possibly Sibley was involved in setting up Wright's shop in Boston. One of the things we found about Sibley was that he was so skilled as a machinist that he would build machines for other machine shops to run their shop. Specialized machines for mostly. It's not mentioned what they were for, but that's one of the connections to railroad. There's an article about him building a machine for a shop that made parts for locomotives.
Wow.
So it also makes sense that he was building machines for musical instrument makers to run their shops.
Kind of going back to something you said before about your Graves circular and how it's the only B flat circular that we know.
No, it was the over the shoulder. Sorry, I mentioned that in passing. So
okay. What was the one of a kind that you own?
Graves B flat over the shoulder.
Yeah. So with the horn being one of a kind and with it being in B flat, I was wondering your opinions on the reason for the scarcity of some of these instruments if they were so popular during the time. I know that there's some theories and stories that kind of go around, but I was wondering what your thoughts on that are.
I think it's multiple reasons. I think for one thing, the E-flat soprano was the solo instrument. More of the more expensive instruments were built for the E-flat players in more numbers. The B-flat in the early bands was considered an alto. I think in the Dodworth book, they even call it an alto, the B-flat alto, sax horn or cornet. So it was kind of a melody instrument. So that, think of the alto horn today, what we think of alto horns.
Yeah.
That's how they saw the B flat cornet in those early years.
Interesting.
So not as many of them were treasured and kept in good condition. So a lot more of them probably got thrown out or, ruined handed to the kid and he ruined it, that kind of thing. And probably even more reasons than that, but that seems to make the most sense to me.
Do you think there's any credibility to the two stories of either over the shoulders or circulars being converted to bell front instruments or the missile casing theory?
Anything brass would get scrapped and recycled. And what I said before about the E flats, there would have been more high value E flats around, so more number of B flats would have been recycled, scrapped. So I kind of discount that. I mean, anything that's scrapped when it has low enough value. Remind me again what you were saying. Sorry.
No, it's like just if the scrap metal or if the bell conversion would lead to less.
Oh, the conversion, yeah. Certainly, we do see a lot of not a lot. We do see instruments that were converted from over the shoulder to bell front, and a few rare cases where you can see the other way around, upright baritone converted to over the shoulder. I don't think very many of them were converted and then never understood to have been converted. They would have been converted, used by a kid, and then thrown away or scrapped. And that would have happened to the E flats as well. It's not. And when you really think about it, I guess because the E flats went out of vogue, they weren't going to be used as much, and so perhaps more B flats were converted to bell front. And eventually used up and thrown away. But I don't think that the numbers were that large. By the time the over the shoulders were completely out of vogue and considered pretty worthless, there were so many really cheap European instruments available. You could buy a brand new cornet for $12, and how much labor would it cost to convert one? I'm not sure what that would be, but why not buy a brand new one?
I was wondering, we were talking about brand new instruments, kind of maybe a fourth segue here on my part, but we were talking about instrument reproductions, so like a brand new old instrument. You do some reproducing, correct? And I'm just wondering how you got into instrument reproduction. Maybe you're saying you reproduce instruments for yourself before you were able to get them, to restore, like that circular cornet. But is that maybe how you got into reproducing?
No, that was a singular case.
Okay, gotcha.
Actually, going back to Barthold music again, he had a number of Civil War era instruments, and this would have been the late 70s. And he told me, he said, these things are becoming valuable. You should start making these. And his idea was to take like a modern piston valve trumpet and make the bell point over your shoulder and then sell that to these Civil War bands who were desperate for over the shoulder instruments. And that never appealed to me at all. I never made anything like that while I was at Barthold Music. But it wasn't long after that, after I started my own shop in 79. 79 is also the year that F.E. Olds went out of business and they auctioned off everything that was left in the factory. So there were just thousands of new old stock Olds parts floating around Southern California back then. And I was broke at the time of the auction, so I couldn't bid on any of the lots that were being sold. But I later bought things from people that did buy. They would have these big roller bins full of parts, and you had to bid on like 2 or 3 of these bins full of parts. I don't remember what they went for, but So these guys would buy these bins and, figuring, well, I'll scrap some of it. I'll try to use some of it and the rest I'll sell off. So I bought parts from guys that had bought these bins full of Olds parts. And that included a lot of rotary valves and a few bells and things and crooks, things that I would need. And so I think by about 80 or 81, I thought, well, I can make a new over-the-shoulder cornet now. So with the Olds French horn rotary valves and an Olds bell, I built the first replica that I ever made. And it was all brand new parts. It wasn't just hacked up old horns.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So did you, for that first cornet example, did you just use those parts and make it into the shape of what you kind of recognize it as being, or were you actually using those parts and referring back to a design of maybe an instrument collection or a schematic or something?
Yeah, it's funny how memory is from your when you're in your 20s, because I do remember really well. I was working out of just a garage in a rented house, a house that I rented, and I didn't have access to original over-the-shoulder instruments, so I was looking for pictures in books and things. And I remember the picture that I had was it was an ad in the back of the American Musical Instruments Society journal of an E-flat cornet. I thought, oh, here we go. Here's a real nice picture, a real good photograph. This is how I'm going to make it. And it wasn't even an American-made instrument; it was an import, but that didn't really matter. It was the right shape. So yeah, it just based on a photograph, basically, and what the few originals I had seen by then.
Yeah. And I know we talked to like Randy Cable, and we've talked to a number of other people that have purchased and extensively used your instruments. After that first over-the-shoulder instrument that you made, did you eventually kind of create your own design, or were you copying other specific instruments, as you got more into it, or how did that work?
Yeah, well, it was always an evolving thing. I always wanted to make them as accurate to the originals as possible. But like I mentioned earlier, it's always a balancing act. I have to be able to make this to a price that I can sell it to somebody. I'm not going to make instruments that I'm just going to pile up in the shop and go broke, and then they auction them off.
True. Yeah.
So yeah, using as many mass-produced parts as I can, and even the earliest over-the-shoulders, large horns that I made, I would use like the large branches from. I'm trying to remember now; it's just so many years ago. But like some of the branches from marching baritone horns or something, I would use for the bottom branch of a over-the-shoulder bass. That kind of thing. And acoustically, it worked okay. It was not necessarily ideal, and I realized that at the time. But I mean, my instruments were cheap. I think the first over-the-shoulder tuba I made would have been about 1984, I think, 83. I probably sold it for $1,200. It was a lot of work. Anyway, but I realized that as good as they were, it wasn't ideal. So eventually I started making all the branches myself. It was a lot of work, but I could make them dimensionally correct. So they were better instruments.
Yeah. I
never made any of the large bells. The only bells that I'm able to make in my shop are the soprano bells and the key bugle bells. That's pretty much it.
So with the smaller instruments that you are folding and forming metal for, are you making like copies of specific instruments then with the instruments that you are doing custom metal work for? Or are they still kind of like your own like Frankenstein design?
Oh man. That's not a good way of putting it. But there's a lot of truth to it. Again, as time went on, I tried to make them more and more accurate. And I got to the point where all the E-flat and B-flat cornets were pretty good, pretty close to originals. I made a copy of the E.G. Wright soprano bell. So, because there's no modern equivalent that's really that close to that. So that was one I decided to make myself. And I eventually had rotary valves made to the right bore sizes, so that like the E flat soprano shouldn't have a 468 bore. It should have something around 435.
Gotcha.
So the larger instruments I always used modern bells that were as close as I could come.
Yeah. If you had an E flat bass with something that required as long of a bell as that, what type of bell?
Well, if you look at the pictures on my website, it would be like a normal tuba bell, and then connected to a branch. The bell wouldn't be the full length of the instrument.
Gotcha.
And the last half a dozen or so that I made always had a removable bell. Partly as I got older, I realized this is really stupid to have to hold this long tuba in front of the buffing machine all day long, because it takes like a full day to polish one of those things.
Thanks.
And so I made the bells removable, and there are a few examples of original over-the-shoulder instruments where the bell is original, so that is somewhat authentic. Even one of the Graves, there's a Graves over-the-shoulder bass, B-flat bass, euphonium size instrument. Really, really wonderful instrument and well preserved too. That the bell unscrews right at that point where I was making them unscrew. And so I can say it's authentic.
Yeah, of course.
I've seen Fisk that way. I've seen a few others.
Great. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. What would you say is the hardest part to reproduce for you when you're doing these jobs, or is it kind of different from horn to horn that you're doing?
The first thing that comes to mind is the bottom curve on an ophicleide.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I never was 100% sure I knew how they did that originally, but they probably tooled up and they were able to do it. They were made in halves normally, lateral halves, and then brazed together. And, so I would be hammering these things out by hand. It's very, very difficult. But by the last, I think I only made 3 or 4 bass ophicleides. But I did end up with some pretty rudimentary tools, just things to hammer against, to form these things. Even the small ones, I've kind of priced myself out of the market now. I'm just not willing to work that hard for so little money anymore. So
yeah, okay.
I've had a couple of guys approach me to make over-the-shoulder D-flat cornets recently, and the most recent one is already backed out, and it was just too expensive. He could buy an original. Well, actually, no, his son was going to play it, and he decided to play an E-flat soprano anyway, so they found an over-the-shoulder E-flat soprano for less than I could make one for. So,
So are you now mostly doing like repair work and not so much like complete fabrication of new instruments?
Yeah. I figure I probably make one new instrument a year now. That's plenty.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It's mostly, I'm kind of mostly retired or semi-retired now. And I have a shop in the behind the house again, like I started. I've told you about the garage that I rented.
Yeah.
We built a pretty nice shop,
nice.
Small shop here, and it's nice to just not have to work 12 hours a day anymore. And
of course.
Go out and work in the garden or whatever, work on the house.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Are you still doing any playing or playing with any groups or anything, or not?
No, not in quite a while. The only serious playing I did of this kind was with the California Gold Rush Band in the 90s. It's hard to believe it was that long ago now, but it's over 25 years now.
Yeah.
And that was quite a good group too. It was all Southern California professionals, which is kind of funny too, because when Steve Sharpie, the guy that started it, when he first approached me, I was negative, and I said, I've heard a lot of these bands, they're not very good. I don't really want to be involved. And then I show up for this thing, and I realize who I'm playing with, and I think, oh my goodness, I'm the worst player in this group. And they kind of tolerated me because they thought it'd be good to have me along. I knew more about the horns than they did, and all that.
His products have been incredible. Steve Sharpey's recordings and the bands and stuff.
Yeah, I think he was good at getting those things together. It always amazed me what he was able to do. He did a keyed bugle presentation, where he talked a lot about Francis Johnson. I know you've covered that pretty thoroughly. And, I agree with Jeff Stockham and Rodney Marsalis.
Yeah.
Yep.
That not enough is known by the public about Francis Johnson. Too many people think, well, it's a real interesting story because he was a black keyed bugle player, but he was a superstar in his day. He wasn't just a black keyed bugle player. I mean, his life is much more interesting than that, although that is a really fascinating part of it, that he was able to do what he did as a black man in a white world,
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. Incredible story, definitely.
I was wondering, since you have so much experience with these historical instruments, if you have a particular maker who is your favorite, and if you do, why that person might be your favorite.
It probably varies, but the ones that I keep talking about, Graves and Wright, I think are usually my two favorites. Graves started earlier, and Wright did more. He took it further. Graves did an amazing thing for, starting. I've even driven through Winchester, New Hampshire, and you drive over the river where his shop was and everything, and you think it's still a rural backwater today. Imagine in 1825 when he moved there.
Yeah, well.
Setting up an industrial shop making brass musical instruments. It's just an amazing story. So it's pretty amazing history to begin with, and that's the kind of thing that really gets me going too. Is the earliest makers and what they did and how they did it, and then Wright kind of took it from there, and built a pretty big shop, building really, really good instruments. It's good. It was hype at the time when they said they were as good or better than anything from Europe. But when you compare them, they really were. They were comparable. The U.S. industry was always behind the European industry in technology, and American-made instruments were always more expensive because we didn't have the history and the number of workers trained and all that kind of stuff. So things were always more expensive here, but when you compare the quality, both mechanically and even more so acoustically, of some of the best of the American instruments, it's pretty astounding what they were able to do.
Yeah.
And then the E.G. Wright shop ended up being the Boston Musical Instrument Manufactory, and I've worked on hundreds, if not thousands, of these instruments, and if they haven't been completely ruined, by abuse and bad repairs and everything else, they are always really good playing instruments. Acoustically, they're really good designs. And that boggles the mind, that they were able to do that in a country that was behind the times industrially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
it's interesting we talk. Sorry,
I was just going to say we were playing catch up, doing a really good job of catching up, and we all know we ended up surpassing them eventually, but not yet.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned New Hampshire again, because earlier in the conversation, this is a little bit of a tangent, but there's a cool museum. I think it's in Vermont, but it's called the American Precision Museum, and it's exactly what the name would imply. It's a museum all about precision machinery in the United States. I think it's in Windsor, Vermont, but I've mentioned before my dad's a tool and die maker, so a couple of summers ago. Yeah, my fiance is an opera singer, and she was singing with an opera company doing a young artist program in Vermont, New Hampshire, up by Dartmouth. And so on my way back down from visiting her, I stopped through that museum, and they've got a whole bunch of like really old lathes, and I think they have the Bridgeport milling machine that's the serial number 1 or serial number 0,
Wow.
One of the first ones. And that's really neat. And it's amazing, you know, how like the history of the need to get things, you know, so precise in manufacturing, and just the ingenuity that it took
Right.
to, you know, make the machining to then make those gears and products and stuff. And it blows my mind, because it's not, you know, a world that I live in. But, you know, for my dad, I remember texting him while I was there that they had the first Bridgeport, and he was like, yeah, we've probably got Bridgeports number 2, 3, and 4 at our plant. You know, they never buy a new one. So, but that's interesting. If anyone's ever passing through Windsor, Vermont, I'm pretty sure that's the town where it is.
Yeah, I think I have heard of that, but I would love to go there someday.
Yeah, it's pretty small, but they have a lot of neat stuff there. And I think they have like an apprenticeship program with some college that's close by. And I remember when I was visiting, they had a few, you know, young people in, you know, explaining things and doing some demonstrations. I remember they have a gear cutting machine that was on a U.S. Navy ship or something, and they make little keychains and stuff. And so that's what, you know, the apprentices were kind of, you know, showing people how that kind of stuff worked. But really neat place. Yeah.
Yeah, that's as you're talking to, I'm looking for a reference. I was talking about Henry Sibley earlier and how important he was to the industry and the locomotives and everything. He also there's an article about him correcting a lead screw on a threading machine for a company in Maine. Oh, here it is. I found it. A company in Maine, the lead screw was incorrect or had too much slop in it. It's hard to tell, you know, journalism even back then, they weren't always that correct. But it's hard to, I think it was just too sloppy. They said he corrected it, but I think he just made a new screw and nuts for it to make thread. I'm looking for the name of the original company in Maine. I don't find it now, but it says the screw cut for the Maine firm, now the Brown and Sharp Manufacturing Company of Providence, Rhode Island. So Henry Sibley had something to do with the early tool making by Brown and Sharp, which if you heard your dad talking much, I'm sure you've heard it talk about Brown and Sharp and their importance to measuring tool is what we think of them as now, but they did everything back in the 19th century.
I didn't know that the instrument makers, or at least some of them, were, though, I don't know, not necessarily interdisciplinary, but were machining and doing that type of textile and manufacturing work between different disciplines. You know, I kind of always thought of them just as being trumpet makers kind of thing. I didn't know if they would be jumping between trains and all kinds of things.
Well, it's kind of like, you know, a little bit later when most of the guys that ended up making the early automobiles started out with bicycles, of all things. And you know, some started with coach building, you know, building horse-drawn coaches, and some came from railroad shops and such. But most of them, you know, started out in bicycle shops, went on to build automobiles. And the Wright brothers did too. They started with famously as bicycle makers, and then were the first ones to fly.
Yeah, there you go. I remember when you and I were talking the other day, you were mentioning the case that you have kind of up against the wall, and some of your instruments there. I know we touched on some earlier, but were there any other instruments that you wanted to kind of talk about or highlight that are in your collection?
We spoke briefly of Richardson. I do one of the circular cornets is a Richardson. It's in C with a whole step cutoff valve, so C and D, and you know, has a crook for B flat also, which they always do. That's a real fascinating one. That's even before that I was fascinated with Richardson, but once I got that instrument, I did even more research. I had restored a bell front Richardson for a customer, and was fascinated because usually when I see a name that I'm not familiar with, I make the assumption that, oh, that's an import. The guy just engraved his name on it. So that's what I thought about Richardson until I had the thing in my hands, and I realized, nope, this is not an import. This is made in Boston. And so I did a lot of research on Richardson. So that I have two pages on Richardson, one on that bell front and one on my circular. And between the two is probably all the history known about Richardson.
That's cool.
So that's a real notable instrument. And then the Graves post horn. Just looking, obviously my favorites are in the display case.
Yeah.
I have an E.G. Wright E-flat keyed bugle that is solid nickel silver, which probably the only one in existence that's all nickel silver, which is kind of funny because there's probably a dozen or more made of sterling silver. So they're more common than the nickel silver.
Interesting. In your collection, are you mostly hanging out in high brass land, or do you have some mid to lows also?
I have less of the bigger instruments than I used to. Just they take up more room,
That's true.
I have an early Fisk tuba, bell up, probably mid to late 1850s. So that's kind of fun. It's so early. And I've one Offa Clyde, probably one or two alto horns. Not much. Oh, and I think I told you about the Allen and Hall B flat bass, which is pretty neat. Early 1860s.
Any percussion instruments or pure brass?
No woodwinds, no percussion.
Yeah. The way it should be. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, I don't let woodwinds in the shop. They have to stop at the door.
There you go.
Yeah.
So Jeff Stockham was talking about mouthpieces and that whole issue. Yeah, I don't have anything new to add to the discussion about whether to use authentic or modern. But he was talking about the Graves reproduction that we had made by Canstel about 8 or 10 years ago. And he said, well, it's not available because the Canstel shop has shut down. But that's not true. Actually, Jim New, that made the mouthpieces there, has all the files. He can make that mouthpiece still. If someone wants a Graves reproduction E-flat soprano mouthpiece, get in contact with Jim New. And if you can't find, he's in Utah now. If you can't find him, contact me and I'll figure out how to get it going.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great to know. Thank you for that.
Yeah, very good to know.
Have you ever experimented with manufacturing mouthpieces at all?
Only enough to know that I'm not the mouthpiece maker. I mean, I have made some reproduction mouthpieces. Some of them I try really, really hard to make them as close to the original as possible. But I end up realizing that I've spent half a day making one mouthpiece, and man, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
Like for Steve Ward, because he was willing to pay for it, I made a copy of a well, I was going to say Fisk, but actually I think it was a Graves, because he has an original Fisk E-flat tuba mouthpiece. I think I copied his Fisk mouthpiece to put on my Fisk tuba. And then I think I copied Mark Elrod's. Or as you get older, you realize your memory starts going. All those things I remember about the late 70s and early 80s, but anyway, I can't remember who I made one of these mouthpieces for 2 years ago. Anyway, I made a Graves reproduction mouthpiece, either for Steve Ward or Mark Elrod, one of those two. Well, the other two makers, Boston makers, I mentioned Sibley. The other one that we haven't mentioned that is even more obscure is Thomas Payne, who probably made the first rotary valve instruments in Boston.
Right. Yeah, I remember reading about Thomas Payne in one of Eliason's the book where he talked about 4 brass makers, and I forget which particular book that was, but one of them.
I think early American brass instrument maker or something. Payne was interesting. Now that I think about it, I haven't seen any connection between he and Henry Sibley. That would be something that would be fun to find. But Thomas Payne was one of the earliest in the industry in Boston.
I'm sure Sibley made a screw for him at some point.
Yeah. But I think Payne was known to have made a couple of key bugles as well. So there may have been a connection there. Sibley was making them in his shop.
Very cool. Now that we've mentioned that, as we maybe use this as our kind of a wrap-up topic, now that you're saying that you're kind of going into retirement and doing about one a year, type of thing. I was wondering what your thoughts are in terms of accessibility to instruments today, in terms of either the antique horns or even reproductions, kind of what you think the state of the union is.
Yeah, I was interested in how you guys have covered that so far. And, there has been a lot of damage done to original instruments on the Civil War reenactment field, and other places. And, more and more, as these things have gotten more valuable and more rare, people are taking better care of them. But early on, there were a lot of very, very, they may not have been recognized how rare and important historically they were at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of instruments have gotten badly damaged and badly repaired, and et cetera, et cetera. So less of that is happening now, which is a good thing. If there is a resurgence in interest in, recreating mid-19th century bands, ideally we should have a better supply for new instruments that are, as, like I've said before, as close as possible to the originals. Mm-hmm. And probably they will be coming from China, as much as that bugs me. Mm-hmm. But there's no way around it. They're just too expensive to build here.
Yeah.
There's several people approached Zig Cancel when he was still designing and building new designs, because there was a period in Cancel's life, his last decade or so, where he was willing to do almost anything. He made chimbassos and mm-hmm. Compensating euphoniums. You're probably familiar with that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever played one of those, but I think they play better than the current Bessons. In my opinion, better in tune anyway. Mm-hmm. He was willing to tool up to make all these instruments. Part of what ended the company, because the debts were high at the end, and
gotcha.
Too hard to it was too hard to keep the place going profitably. Anyway, so the point of that story is that several people did approach Zig Cancel, can you make these over-the-shoulder instruments for me? And his answer was always, yes, sure. And, so then the next question is how much? And so he has to come up with a price for the prototype, and then how much each one will be after that. And so, the prototype is going to be $6,000, and then each one after that is going to be $2,500. So it's just too expensive for someone to have Cancel make over-the-shoulder instruments and then sell them for a profit. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of people contact me and they say, how much for a over-the-shoulder B-flat cornet? And how, can you send me one next week? No. Yeah. Especially when I was busy making, between half a dozen and a dozen instruments a year. The backlog grew to be almost 3 years, So it's, most of them I'd be telling, I'll let you know when to send the deposit, but it's going to be a couple of years.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of what I'm doing now too, is I don't even have a backlog anymore. I don't make many promises. I don't work for kids, and just much lower stress level.
Yeah, of course. Well, it's good. You've
earned it.
You've worked hard, so you get some time off. It's okay.
Yeah, thanks.
We're obviously we're gonna link to your website and to any specific projects or things that we mentioned that are on your website. We can additionally link to even more specific links and stuff in our show notes, and on YouTube we'll put it in the item description. The research and stuff that you've contributed to the field also, in your cataloging and all that kind of stuff that you've made available on your website is incredibly valuable. So
good.
Hopefully people express the value of the work you've done, even with just the website, to you. And if they're not, I'm telling you right now, it's very significant and extremely helpful. So thank you for all the work with the website.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear. And I'm hoping that you guys are successful in drumming up more interest in this, between people listening to the podcast and going to my website and reading that stuff and, whatever else, other resources available. It'd be nice to see a resurgence of interest.
Yeah. So Rob, this has been a great conversation. We really appreciate you taking the time to do it. We've mentioned your website, a bunch throughout the episode, but just one more time, where can people go to find out more about, the work you've done and all the resources that you've taken the time to put up online?
That's pretty much it. RobbStewart.com, RobbStewart. I think there is a Robb Stewart with one B. He's, oddly enough, I think he's a music industry lawyer.
There you go.
Which is kind of an odd coincidence. But so put that second B in there. And if you Google Robb Stewart spelled any possible way with brass at the end of it, you'll find my website. So,
gotcha.
Good to know.
The internet's pretty amazing. Someone was, off on another tangent. I think maybe I even mentioned this to you, Chris. Someone was telling me that the guy sent me an email saying, you spelled Fahrenheit wrong on your website. He didn't tell me where it was. So I went to a page where I knew I had used the word Fahrenheit and it was spelled correctly. So I Googled Robb Stewart Fahrenheit spelled the way he said I spelled it, and it popped up. And so I saw, oh, there it is. The internet is pretty astounding.
Yeah, for sure. It knows your website better than you do, right?
Yeah, exactly. And hopefully if anybody, go to the website first before even calling or emailing, and, you'll probably find a lot of the answers there.
Cool.
All right.
Well, it was great meeting you and chatting and all this great stuff. Hopefully we can, hopefully run into you in person at some time when things all settle down, and if there's any events or brass get-togethers or something, hopefully we can grab a drink or something all in person at some point.
Yeah, I hope so.
All right.
I'm really glad you guys are doing this. This is a great resource.
Thank you again to Robb Stewart for coming on to the Early American Brass Band podcast. As we mentioned at the top of the show, we were really excited and honored to finally get Rob on the show with us. His name's come up multiple times, and he is one of the giants in our field. So thank you again to him for taking the time to come and speak with us.
Definitely, and especially since he's all the way on the other coast of the United States. I know it was a kind of an early morning for him, kind of mid morning for us. So we definitely appreciate him, taking the time out of his day to talk with two doctoral students from the other side of the country. So you can follow along with us for any updates from the show on any social media platform. We've got Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. If you'd like to support the show further, you can do that on Patreon or by buying some merch from our Teespring store. And all of those links will be up on our website, www.eabbpodcast.com. They'll be right there at the top bar of the homepage for you to check out. So we hope that you'll follow us on social media and maybe grab a mug or a shirt or a hat or something if you feel so inclined.
This episode's featured album is a recording project that Robb Stewart was actually a part of. This is by the California Gold Rush Band and is an album titled Brass Mounted Army, Music of the Old Horse Cavalry. This album is kind of difficult to come by, but there is a website where it's available for purchase, which we will link to in our show notes, and we will also provide some information on our show notes about this album that isn't available anywhere except for the physical copy of the CD. So go check out the Brass Mounted Army by the California Gold Rush Band. Thank you very much for tuning into the Early American Brass Band podcast, and we will see you next week.